So you're walking down the aisle in the grocery store, and you need to stop in the baking and sweetener section to pick up some more honey. And so you're reaching to the shelf and you're grabbing your usual raw, unfiltered honey. And as you're leaving the aisle, you're seeing tons of options for artificial sweeteners and zero-calorie sweeteners and everything. And on the shelf, you see aspartame, and you're thinking in your head, well, no, I'm not going to do aspartame because aspartame has been linked with various cancers. And right next to it, you see sucralose. And so you reach for the box and you pick it up and you're reading the ingredients and you're reading the facts on this box. And so the ingredients just says sucralose, and in the little fact sheet it says 200 times sweeter than sugar, 0 calorie. And you're thinking to yourself, how is that possible? How can it be 200 times sweeter than sugar, but 0 calories? And so you go online and you start researching everything you can about sucralose. And you find that people are, backing this up, saying it's 0 calorie, 200 times sweeter than sugar, and there's no bad health effects. But is that actually true? Well, let's talk about the science behind that.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello all you scientists, welcome on back to The Science Behind That. I am your host, Atticus Hamilton. And as you heard from the intro, on today's episode we're going to be talking about sucralose. We're going to be talking about what it is, any health effects of it, and of course what all that means for you. So this is probably going to be a longer episode. There's a lot of biochemistry we have to talk about. There's a lot of, I guess I'm going to do my best to summarize this biochemistry, because it does get pretty heavy. But before I do that, ladies and gentlemen, please go grab yourselves a nice steaming hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup to it, and we'll jump right into today's episode. So sucralose. So what is sucralose? Well, sucralose is basically a brand name. The actual name for the compound is 1,6-dichloro-1,6-dideoxy-beta-D-fructofuranosyl 4-chloro-4-deoxy-alpha-D-galactopyranoside. So that is a long name. And sucralose was actually created by accident in 1975 when a laboratory leader at Queen Elizabeth College told an assistant to test the chemical that they had created. And the assistant, I guess, misunderstood the laboratory leader and thought she said taste. And after tasting the compound they created, they discovered it had a very sweet taste. And so sucralose was originally created as part of an investigation for a potential pesticide. But through this process of chlorinating sucrose, they discovered that it tasted sweet. And then the research team filed for a patent in 1976 and received that patent in 1984. But the name sucralose is a marketing name by Tate and Lyle, and that was invented with it had no scientific basis. The first time it was on the market, it was on the market through a company called McNeil Nutritionals, which at the time was a subsidiary of the company Johnson & Johnson, the company that made the really bad COVID vaccines, that one. So it was marketed as Splenda, and it was marketed as made from sugar, so it tastes like sugar. Now, that's kind of disingenuous because it's not real. I mean, that's where it gets confusing, because to me that suggests that it's the same as naturally occurring sucrose, which it's not. And so anyway, there's a lot of new brand names now about sucralose, Kukrin, Zero Cal, Novelia, Candice, Sucrana, Candril Yellow, and Sucra Plus, and Splenda, obviously. But today we're going to be talking about what it really is, how it's made, and if there's any detrimental health effects to it. So, of course, when you Google this, like on a Healthline, I guess, and I always give WebMD or Healthline shade, not because they're, I guess, bad necessarily, but because they're not. A lot of times they say things that are not really backed by credible scientific evidence. And so I also like to use it because a lot of times they nicely compile all the allegations made about a substance into one really easy list. And so that's pretty helpful. So what is it? Well, sucralose is basically a sucrose molecule that has 2 chlorine atoms on it. Essentially, I guess it's 3 chlorine atoms, but that's essentially all it is. And so, what is sucrose then? Sucrose is table sugar, but more specifically, sucrose is a glucose that is bound to a fructose. Now, for those of you who have listened to my podcast for a long time, I've done several episodes where I rant about why sugar is bad. One of those episodes was Season 2, Episode 23, Why Does Too Much Sugar Make Us Sick? And in that episode, I go into a very deep explanation of the biochemical pathway of why fructose is the spawn of Satan, where fructose came from, why it's really bad, and why we should avoid it. But I am going to do a brief, I guess, summary of that for you today. And also, while I know sucrose is not the actual name of the compound, the real name that I said previously is way too long. So I am just going to use sucralose for this episode. So when I say sucralose, know that I'm referring to 1,6-dichloro, 1,6-dideoxy beta D fructofuranosyl 4-chloro-4-deoxy alpha D galactopyranoside. So let's talk about sucrose first. So sucrose, as I mentioned, is a molecule that is a glucose bound through an oxygen to fructose, right? And so when you ingest this substance, it's metabolized in the liver primarily. And in the liver, the liver uses a sucrase. I had to think of the enzyme. Liver uses a sucrase enzyme to basically cleave that bond, that hydroxy bond between the glucose and the fructose, cleaves that bond to get one glucose molecule and one fructose molecule. So for every gram of table sugar you have, it's pretty much a 50-50 split, right? Half of it will be glucose, half of it will be fructose. And so glucose and fructose, while they are initially separated from the sucrose in the same way, they do have 2 very different metabolism pathways. So I'll start with glucose first because that's the quickest. Ultimately, glucose in the liver, it can go one of 2 ways. It can either go directly into glycolysis to produce ATP, or it can go into production of glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose. Glycogen is stored by the muscles primarily, and it is the go-to preferred energy storage form of the muscles. And so why is that? Because 2 reasons. A, the storage of glycogen is essentially limitless. And what I mean by this is I'm sure many of you have heard of carb loading. What is the purpose behind carb loading? Well, carb loading is before you're going to do a very vigorous, intense exercise. That could be a very long session in the gym for weightlifting. It could be rock climbing. A lot of times it's like marathon running. And so carb loading is when you ingest a lot of simple carbohydrates that contain a high level of glucose, and that glucose will then be converted into glycogen, and it will fully saturate your muscles with glycogen. So then during that period of physical exercise, the muscles have plenty of glycogen so you can go faster, harder for longer, right? Because everyone knows the feeling of switching to fat metabolism when you're in the gym, especially weightlifting after a long set. You feel sluggish, you feel slow, and so you really want to, at least for athletic performance purposes, you want to stay on that glycogen metabolism pathway, right? Because the glycogen is broken up into constituent glucose molecules really easily. Then that glucose is fed immediately into glycolysis to produce 32 ATP or thereabouts that will then be used to do muscular work. So that's glucose. On the other hand, we have fructose. Now, fructose can be metabolized in one of two ways. It could either go to produce glycogen, and the thing about fructose is it produces a lot of glycogen. It's more potent than glucose, and so when it is metabolized into glycogen, it produces a lot of glycogen. That's why sports drinks like Gatorade have a lot of high fructose corn syrup in it. It's not for health, it's for post-workout when you're glycogen depleted. Because after you ran a marathon or, done a gym routine of 4 hours in the gym, you are severely glycogen depleted. And so then you'll drink a Gatorade because it'll immediately replenish your glycogen stores. However, when you have, little Timmy, and he's sitting on the couch and he's seeing Serena Williams do an ad for, Gatorade, or his favorite athlete or whatever doing an ad for Gatorade, little Timmy is going to be like, wow, if I drink Gatorade, I must be healthy because my favorite athlete is drinking it. And so then he'll go and drink a Gatorade, and he'll just drink the Gatorade while he's sitting on the couch watching, the Olympics or whatever. But he's not glycogen depleted. So what happens then when you ingest fructose when you're not glycogen depleted? Well, then it enters metabolism pathway number 2, which is to produce a compound in the liver called VLDL. Now, I'm not going to go into the in-depth biochemical process that occurs from ingestion of fructose to the production of VLDL in the liver, because it's like a 30-step process, and we would be here forever. I do go into it in depth in episode 23, season 2, Why Does Sugar Make Us Sick? I do go into an in-depth explanation there, so definitely take a listen to that if you want. But ultimately, fructose ingestion in metabolism pathway number 2 produces a compound called VLDL, which is very low-density lipoprotein. Now, this very low-density lipoprotein, it will leave the liver and go to the muscles, where the muscles will convert it from VLDL into LDL, or low-density lipoprotein. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is bad cholesterol. So there's two different types of low-density lipoprotein. One is really bad, and one is like less bad. You have SB, small buoyant, and large buoyant low-density lipoprotein. Large buoyant is the worst. SB, or a small buoyant, is kind of it's not great, but it's not bad. But anyway, fructose it will produce more large buoyant than small buoyant. But anyway, then once that LDL is produced, or the bad cholesterol is produced, it'll be shuttled back to the liver through the bloodstream. And when it's going through the bloodstream, it doesn't like to stay in aqueous solution very well, and so precipitates out of the blood and collects along the vascular endothelium of the arteries and the veins, and it collects there. And then your macrophages come along, and they think it's a pathogenic threat, so they eat that LDL, and they become immobile. They turn into a cell called a foam cell. And this foam cell, it's alive, but it can't move. But it still produces pro-inflammatory cytokines, which recruit more macrophages and more immune cells. And they eat more of this LDL, and the plaque gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it gets to a certain point where the immune system is like, shit, there's a there's an infection going on here. We need to wall this off. And then so they wall it off with other cells, primarily lymphocytes. They wall that off, and then there you go. You have an occluded artery. You have a 99% occluded artery, right? And that is the process of atherosclerosis. So people talk all the time about saturated fats being bad. Saturated fats are not the things that produce LDL. And LDL is the root cause of atherosclerosis or heart disease. Okay? LDL is the root cause. Saturated fat doesn't produce it. Fructose produces it. Saturated fat kind of downregulates the chemical response that regulates the levels of LDL, but that was for a different story, and I actually did an episode on that as well. Let me pull that up. That was Season 4, Episode 2, February 13th. Is saturated fat really that bad? So if you want to hear more about that, please listen to that episode, and I go into great detail about it, about saturated fat there. So anyway, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about this because I'm very anti-sugar. But anyway, so what does that mean for fructose or for sucralose? Well, sucralose is different than sucrose, right? Because it has a chlorine atoms. Sucrase, the enzyme that breaks down sucralose, is unable to break down sucrose. So when it was created, there was this research that showed that, and everyone was like, oh, that's great. It's 0 calorie then because it can't be broken down. It's not metabolized by the liver. And the vast majority of it in trials, the vast majority of sucralose when administered through feeding to mice and rats in trials is either excreted in the feces or the urine in its unmodified form, right? So everyone was like, oh, that's great. And then in 1995, the FDA allowed the use of sucralose in over 6,000 different food applications. And then that was further expanded in 1999. And then we had more research coming out about the acute effects of sucralose in this research paper titled Sucralose, an Overview of the Toxicity Data. And that was published in July of 2000 in the the Journal of Food and Chemical Toxicology. And ultimately, this concluded that for the most part, there are no detrimental effects. And so that was in 2000, basically less than a year after the FDA expanded access to sucralose. And so that added more oxygen to the fire, basically. And the fire being, yes, sucralose is safe, because then the FDA had more data saying, hey, look at this. This is data that says that it's all good. But is it all good? Well, recently a study came out that showed that in mouse models, ingestion of sucralose, while it's not broken down by the liver, it is modified by your gut microbiota. And what the gut microbiota does is it actually acetylates the sucralose. And so what does that mean? Well, through the process of acetylation, it produces a molecule called sucralose 6-acetate, which is a carcinogen. And so that particular paper showed that in mouse models, this sucralose 6-acetate, which is also left as a residue in most commercial sucralose products from the production of sucralose, it is a very nasty carcinogen. So much so that it causes, it was shown to cause a Crohn's disease-like illness in the test mice. It increased the permeability of the intestinal tract in the mice, and it reduced the ability of the intestines to absorb nutrients, along with acetylating, or along with having extreme affinity towards the sugar phosphate backbone of DNA and breaking that apart. So obviously that sounds like, oh my God, that's not great. And so that was kind of the paper. It came out, I think 2 months ago. And that was part of the paper. That was the paper that gave me this idea to do this episode. And so I decided to do some more research, and I found there was a 2016 study from Razmazi Institute published in the International Journal of Occupational and Environmental Health that examined sucralose consumption in mice. And they found a significant dose-related increase incidence of males bearing malignant tumors and a significant dose-related increase incident of hematopoietic neoplasmas in males, particularly at a dose of 2,000 and 16,000 parts per million. So, obviously, that data suggests that sucralose may not actually be biologically inert, as was concluded in the 90s and the early 2000s. And of course, more studies are needed. And that's the problem right there, right? So if you go to Healthline and they say, oh, it's pretty much safe, but long-term studies have mixed results and more study is needed. And that really is the case because there isn't a lot of long-term studies out there. But anyway, we have another one here. So that was about leukemia. And so I guess at the end of that, it suggests that it may be worth the while to look into more data as to does sucralose increase the risk of leukemia? Because in mice, it seemed to do so. And, how could you do that in a human trial? That's the question, right? Because mouse models don't always translate very well to human models. And, we've seen that time and time again. And sometimes they just do not translate well into, data that we can extrapolate to humans. But anyway, in 2023, so this year, a study in the Biomedicines Journal reported that newborns from mothers who intensely consumed sucralose during pregnancy were heavier and exhibited markers of metabolic alteration and low-grade systemic inflammation. And this is in addition to a lot of data in animals that shows that sucralose intake during gestation can predispose the offspring to weight gain, metabolic disturbances, and low-grade systemic inflammation. However, information in humans specifically is not there. And their study went on further to say that in comparison of newborns to mothers with a high sucralose intake to a low sucralose intake, the high sucralose intake mothers displayed a significant increase in birth weight and insulin compared to newborns from low sucralose intake mothers. We have another study here, 2014 in Nature, pointed to risks of consuming artificial sweeteners generally and sucrose specifically for diabetes patients. The paper determined that the consumption of artificial sweeteners drives the development of glucose intolerance through the induction of a compositional and functional alterations in the intestinal microbiota. And that is very believable to me, right? We are discovering more and more every day that our microbiota, or the microorganisms that live with us, play a massive role in our overall health. And so it's not surprising, I guess, to me to hear that sucralose is modifying our microbiota. And in doing so, it may actually affect patients with diabetes in terms of insulin resistance and insulin production. And of course, I don't think it comes as that much of a surprise either, since it's the microbiota in the first place that may be actually acetylating the sucralose to produce sucralose 6-acetate. And of course, there's another there's been studies in 2013, 2008, 2016 that all talk about consumption, that all have data to support that heavy consumption of sucralose increases weight gain, it decreases metabolism, and that chronic consumption of sucralose triggers a conserved neuronal fasting response and increases the motivation to eat. And so there's impacts to insulin, genotoxicity. And so this was the study that I was referencing. In May 2023, this year, a study in the Journal of Toxicology and Environmental Health titled Toxicological and Pharmacokinetic Properties of Sucralose 6-Acetate concluded that Sucralose 6-acetate is both produced upon consumption of sucrose and is a leftover product in sucrose pre-consumption from the manufacturing process, and that Sucralose 6-acetate has extreme genotoxic effects, and that it can dissolve the backbone or the sugar phosphate backbone of DNA, increase endothelial permeability in the intestines, etc. And again, that was in an animal model, but ultimately I could go on and on and on. And there's a lot of studies out here that are relatively recent, from 2016 to now, that are showing all of these different risks. And so I think at the end of the day, the question becomes, what can you do about it? And that is a very difficult thing. If you use a pre-workout, the vast majority of them contain sucralose, right? If this is something that, after hearing all of this, you decide to go and do your own research and you're like, wow, Atticus was right. There are a lot of risks, or a lot of data that suggests there's risks associated with consumption of sucrose. I don't want to eat this anymore. It becomes difficult. And this is something that I found surprising. It is more difficult to eliminate sucralose from your diet if you are a health-conscious individual than it is to eliminate sugar. And, to me, that is mind-blowing, because there are other options out there for an artificial sweetener. You have monk fruit extract, and you have stevia. And stevia and stevia is kind of like a sugar alcohol, not really, but it's kind of like a sugar alcohol that works in a similar fashion to monk fruit, whereas monk fruit extract is actually just it's a protein, and it binds to the same receptors in your tongue that trigger the sweet taste that sugar does. So, and again, that's non-metabolizable. In both of those, there isn't any data, as far as I can tell, that show any long-term severe health effects. But that's the problem, is sucralose has been championed, I think, as a safe alternative to sugar for so long that it's in almost every health-conscious sugar-free product out there. Medicine has sucrose in it these days. I mean, I was reading the ingredients of a bottle of Mylanta I have, which is an antacid medicine, and it has sucralose in it. Most pre-workouts do. One of the pre-workouts I know that doesn't have it is Transparent Labs. Their pre-workouts do not use sucralose. So, that's a potential option. And I'm not sponsored by Transparent Labs. I just, I like the fact that they don't have sucralose in it. But it's not just that. I mean, you have sugar-free drinks. Companies like Coke, they'll use either sucralose or aspartame. I mean, so it's surprising to me how pervasive it is everywhere. But that being said, it is not impossible to eliminate that from your diet. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope you learned something. And I hope that, at the end of today's episode, it helped some of you out there, making decisions that will impact your life and your health. And that's at the end of the day, that's my goal here, is to make sure that I provide you with the information you need to make the best decisions for you, and that you stand up and question everything. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. I will see you guys all on Friday. Have a great week. Have a great Monday. And I'll see you on Friday. Remember, stand up and question everything.